Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, where religion, culture, and politics intersect in real time. I'm one of your hosts for this episode, Jemar Tisby, joined by Kristin Du Mez
Hi, Jamar. Good to see you.
and Robbie Jones.
Hey, Jamar. Hey, Kristen.
We're scholars, three historians, and a sociologist who explore how religion shapes America's past and present. But the kicker is we're responding in real time to the events of the day. So no preps, no prep, no scripts, just raw, unfiltered conversation. And that's why we call it the Convocation Unscripted. This episode is officially in session. We are missing Diana this week. She is a globetrotter and often has very dramatic stories and adventures on her trips. So we'll let her tell you about that next time, but understand that we are missing her presence, especially this week. We had last week off, and so we were not on the mic when news of Charlie Kirk's murder hit the national and international scene. Of course, a lot of ink has been spilt and posts have been sent about that. And so we're here in, the aftermath of that and talking more generally about the topic of political violence and where we are as a nation, and also the ways people are interpreting who's responsible for the violence, and whether this is a both sides issue or a radical left, as they like to call it, or the far right. Robbie, you have kind of gone down the rabbit hole of this in terms of information, data. Can you kick us off with some hard facts, some cold hard facts here?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's sobering, and anytime you feel like, okay, my mission is to understand the threat of political violence. It's just, I think we're just in a very tough space. But I wanted to start with one that I think tells us something not just about the subject matter, but about the moment we're in. And that is the fact that one of the most reliable sources we have had of kind of the prevalence of political violence in the country actually comes from the government itself, right? Who's been studying this. It's the place that sociologists, criminologists go, right, for the most reliable data. I think not coincidentally, that report in the wake of the awful assassination of Charlie Kirk was removed very quietly from the government's website. And in fact, the most reliable government data for political violence in the country can now only be found on the internet's Wayback Machine, right? It can't be found on our current government. But here's the conclusion. I was going to read the conclusion of this. It was very clear, again, based on 30 years of data of kind of analyzing political violence in the country. And this was their conclusion. Militant, nationalistic, white supremacist, violent extremism has increased in the United States. In fact, the number of far-right attacks continues to outpace all other types of terrorism and domestic violent extremism. Since 1990, far-right extremists have committed far more ideologically motivated homicides than far-left or radical Islamic extremists, including 227 events that took more than 520 lives. In the same period, far-left extremists committed 42 ideological motivated attacks that took 78 lives. So what we're talking about here is a factor of 5. If you compare right-wing extremist violence, left-wing extremist violence, is not to say there certainly is some lamentable violence kind of on the left as well as the right, but they're not commensurate. They're not this is not on both sides. If we're looking for the threats and kind of the likelihood of threats, it's 5 times more likely to come from the right than the left. And Tom Edsall actually had a nice piece in the New York Times where he just kind of went down like all the major studies, like that's the big one. But if we go to the Anti-Defamation League, the Cato Institute, which is certainly no bastion of liberalism, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, these are all places that are like the most credible places for studying this. And they all basically show the same. that right-wing violence is more prevalent than violence from the left. Like that's the conclusion across the board. The one other thing I'll say, in our data, when we ask our principal question is an agree disagree question. It says because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. On that question, I mean, thankfully, we only have like in the kind of 15, 16% of the country agreeing with that. But it's twice as many Republicans. It's 29% Republicans versus 8% of Democrats in our latest data from the American Value Study in 2024 last fall. So, that's just a very consistent picture of what the data has shown from actual violence to even kind of public sentiment about just kind of feelings of justification around violence.
I'll just add to that deluge of data. And I have been looking at this. I went back into some of my notes for speaking and or writing. And there was an article that I wrote in December 2020, citing data from October 2020 from the Department of Homeland Security. What this data shows is to highlight and underline right-wing extremist violence and say it's white supremacist violence in many cases too. So this comes from the Homeland Threat Assessment from the Department of Homeland Security in October 2020. And they say among domestic violent extremists, or DVEs, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, WSEs, will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. So specifically white supremacist extremists. And then it goes on to say white WSEs have demonstrated long-standing intent to target racial and religious minorities, members of the LGBTQ plus community, politicians, and those they believe promote multiculturalism and globalization at the expense of WSE identity. Since 2018, they've conducted more lethal attacks in the United States than any other domestic violent extremist movement. So these data aren't new. We've known for a while, and we've known the specific contours of the people resorting to violence and political violence and who they are targeting. Kristin, anything to add from a historical perspective or a personal perspective?
I think maybe just a reflection here on we're having this conversation. Let's talk about the context just a little bit more, because right now on the right, and by the right I mean this, the Republican Party, almost without exception, right, is using the killing of Charlie Kirk to tar the entire, quote unquote left, radical left, whatever, your favorite term of derision is, in order to justify cracking down, curtailing constitutional rights, the rights of free speech, possibly inciting violence, right? The kind of rhetoric, right, coming out from positions of great power right now. You're hearing things from politicians and from pastors, let me add, that, there is no peace with the left. There can be no peace. This is not a time for peace or love. They want to kill us, right? They want to kill me. People are making it personal, right? The they being used in response to this targeted killing, right? Where we're still learning about the perpetrator and lots of conflicting stories. But, over the past week, all sorts of narratives were coming out from official sources, unofficial sources. But what was interesting is the shifting narrative made zero difference in terms of the messaging, right? That was coming from the right here. which was a kind of sweeping assigning of responsibility to whomever they want to put in that category, right? And I think that this conversation that we're having is not a kind of finger pointing, oh yeah, you're worse, right? That's not the goal here at all, but it is, in a sense, like grounding in reality, pushing back against propaganda, and propaganda that is being employed in a particularly perilous moment that arguably has the potential to unleash further violence, state violence, and really a dramatic change in terms of the rights of half the country.
You know, I want to throw this to you, Jemar. I'm going to put you on the spot too much, but I'm thinking about this. Like, what could the response of the president of the United States have been in the
Yeah.
wake of this? What could the response of J.D. Vance been in the wake of this? What could the response of leading kind of white evangelical pastors, right, on the right? What could that like? If I'm just going to put you on the spot, Jamar, like, channel it, man. Like, what do you think? What would we have hoped for, right, from our highest leaders in the land in a moment like this?
Well, if I were an elected official for a day, um, I often think about that, Robbie, is like we're dealing with the reality as it comes at us. But if we pause and use our imaginations, we could easily envision completely different scenarios. So with something like this, the murder of a prominent um, right-wing commentator in public violently, I would expect leaders to come on and say, with sorrow and grief and mourning, say, this is a sad day for our country. Whether you are Republican or Democrat, subscribe to these beliefs or oppose them, what we're seeing are people who, because of their words, are being killed. This has affected Democratic political officials. It has affected Republican, and it's in blue states and red states. And this is a time for us to come together and remember our shared values. That one of the hallmarks of this nation is the peaceful transfer of power, which is not just about what happens every 4 years. It's what happens every single day when we have views and politics and policies where we disagree on one another. We don't pick up guns. We don't solve it through violence. That's what's made the United States a place where so many want to come and look to as an example of freedom and democracy. And so I would implore us as a people, whatever your status, whatever your convictions, to recognize a life was lost. It's not the first one, but we need to work hard together as a people to make sure it's the last.
Amen.
Yeah,
And Robbie, when you asked that question, what came to my mind, what I would have liked to hear from them is honestly exactly the same thing I would have liked to have heard from them when Melissa Hartman and her husband were killed. Exactly the same thing, right? That this is not which side and how can we best use it to advance whatever political aims that we have. Exactly the same response should be in order. And honestly, I miss that.
Yes.
I miss that. And like you said, Jemar, it's hard to imagine these days, right? That we have to like play this thought experiment because this has become the norm. But not very long ago, this was absolutely not the norm, right?
Mm-hmm.
The killing of any public figure, regardless of where they were on the political spectrum, would have been a moment of reckoning where everybody can stop and ask, what can we do differently?
Mm.
And pray for the victim's family and honestly, it sounds really cheesy and it sounds completely like unrealistic in this moment. Come together and try to build a stronger community and a better society, right? That's what I miss.
That's a great question, Robbie. Where did it come from? What inspired that one?
Well, I was thinking back about, it just made me think about 9/11, right?
Mhm.
And how we had a Republican president, not one I was a big fan of, frankly. But I remember, so I was teaching at Emory actually when this all went down, and you know I was in the student lounge, gathered with students. We would let class out early, watching those televisions, trying to figure out what in the world is going on. People's phones are going off, right? With relatives in New York, and trying to figure out who's safe, who's not, what's happened, you know. And then I remember thinking, like, and I had a professor, who Muslim professor at the law school, and being really worried about him and the reactions in Atlanta. He lived in my neighborhood, and he would take an evening walk, and I would just remember being fearful about that, and I remember being so grateful that George W. Bush like came out and not only like said some words, but he actually went to an Islamic center and spoke from the Islamic, like he put himself in a Muslim space, right, to kind of issue some words to the nation, and made this distinction between terrorism and these people who had done these awful things and the Islamic faith and Muslims throughout the world. I pulled it up. Like he said, we respect your faith. It's a faith practiced by millions of Americans, and millions that Americans count as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah.
Mm.
And I remember thinking about that, right? And like how important it was for him as a leader to step into that space and prevent the demonization of so many people and prevent violence. That statement prevented it,
Yeah.
saved lives by him making that statement, and I remember at the time realizing like, oh, that's exactly what we need right now is, a leader to do that. And not, that was like all the like country music song that will put a boot in your ass, lyrics. We don't need
No
that
repeat.
right now, right? Yeah, we need this. Kind of take a breath, make the right distinctions, think carefully about this, pull us all together. And we're just seeing the opposite of that, right? And that was from a Republican. So I'm not trying to, this is not a partisan thing here we're talking about. That was from a Republican president, right? That was in that moment, I think, helped us be our better selves.
And I think that's what a political leader is there to do. There's a lot of policy stuff that they want to get done and try to get done, but it's to pull us back to foundational principles kind of a thing, especially in a crisis and an emergency. And it's just interesting. This, y'all listening or watching this, is truly unscripted. This is coming out of nowhere. But I've been thinking the past couple of days with grief how no matter how different we are as human beings, as people in a nation, we all basically want the same thing. We really do want to lead quiet lives, have work that's meaningful and pays the bills, have healthy families and relationships, enjoy what we enjoy, whether sports or comedy or knitting or whatever it might be, and just do that. I mean, by and large, we don't have a bunch of folks who just want to flip everything over and disrupt it just for the sake of an ideology.
Yeah.
And it's so tragic to me that we've lost almost any sense of that. I mean, for me, it really started on a very sort of first sight kind of level with COVID, when I would go when we were supposed to all be masking up in public areas, and you could see people who were like making a statement that they would not wear masks, and had to ask myself, like, why are they doing that and what's behind it? And then with social media and different other kinds of media just stoking it, we have become it. I've been honestly thinking about the Civil War in the sense of the constant question was reunification, reconciliation. How do you come back from a division so deep? And that's what I'm thinking about now, is like, if we ever get past this particular regime or what it does, how do we actually come back together? What kind of leader would it take? And more importantly, what kind of message and what kind of narrative it would take? Have y'all thought about that kind of thing? Or do you have thoughts on it?
I do. I think about that, and then I kind of get afraid because I realize we are nowhere near that place. And to get to that place, I'm afraid we have to go through some really awful things. Right. So because I'm with you, there's a lot to be undone here. And I think that there's a lot more cruelty to come, suffering to come. And often the response to cruelty and suffering is more of the same, and anger and hate and vengeance, right? That's kind of the a natural human response, not the only one, but it's available, and it is politically expedient in certain societies, or really, I mean, it is politically expedient towards certain aims, and all of which tells me it's going to get worse before it gets better. And so I can't really think about what it will take to come back together, to bring healing, to patch things together, without a sense for how bad things are going to get.
So, Kristin, I know you've a student of German political history as well, and what I'm thinking about is there was a report that Hannah Arendt wrote from Berlin in 1950. So it's after the war. She's reflecting back. She's been interviewing people in Berlin. And I'm going to paraphrase it here. I won't get it quite right. But the thing that's always stuck with me about that report is she said, it's occurred to me that a great number of educated, she was talking mostly about educated people in Germany, no longer know how to tell the truth, even if they wanted to.
Yep.
Is what she said. And the reason why she said that is because she said, look, the number of people who are actual Nazi sympathizers and active were small.
Mm-hmm.
But there was this big group, right, that decided, okay, I do want to keep my job. So I'll get the Nazi membership card to keep my job. I don't want to get harassed. I'll get the card. Yeah, I'll come to the meeting. And so they kind of do the things, right? And then she had this really interesting psychological insight where she said, you would think that if they only did it for external reasons, that they would have been able to maintain a sort of like inner objection, even while they're doing the outward thing. And she said, but what I found over and over is that people, rather than maintaining the kind of cynicism and dissonance, that they just adjusted their views to finally line up to relieve themselves of the dissonance.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And then once that happened, all the brakes were off, right, for resistance, and because they couldn't even see it themselves anymore, because they had just gradually adjusted themselves to this outward reality. So I've been thinking about that piece a lot, and that we still have some off ramps where we are, but there's some off ramps in the rearview mirror as well, right, that we haven't taken.
A lot of them. Yeah, no, I think that when I think of the German post-war situation too, and I was actually just talking about this with Hannah Reichel last night. I did a webinar, and so quick shout out to their book. I've been shouting it from the rooftops. It's called "For Such a Time as This: An Emergency Devotional." Hannah is a professor of systematic theology at Princeton Seminary, an expert on Karl Barth, and a German themselves. And it was a really illuminating conversation. And one of the things that they shared was a reminder that the kind of reckoning among the German population took a while. And that generation that was complicit was not all the way there. It was really the next generation that came to terms with the levels of complicity, right? For the reasons that you suggest. And I have to say, given my background in German history, I felt a need to kind of shift in recent months. And I've written about this some on Substack, from what we were all doing, the preventative, educating, informing, warning, trying to woo people into doing something, into taking some of those off ramps, right? And now that we're at this point, I'm still looking for the off ramps. Would love to find one to take it. But one of the things that I've been shifting to is preparing ourselves, right? Because what you see is that in authoritarian regimes, people change. People who think they will never change, change really quickly, really quickly. That's the stunning thing. So what are the lessons that we can learn, whether it's from Germany or other nations that have gone through phases with authoritarian regimes? What are the things that each of us can do to prepare ourselves to and this book, by the way, is just filled with practical suggestions, and it's inspired in part by Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny too, so like just drawing from a number of different sources. Things like paying attention to language, right? Things like investing in institutions, things like investing in your neighbors, in local communities, spiritual disciplines, right? This is an emergency devotional. Somebody messaged me yesterday saying that they're not into devotionals, have not read a devotional in good 15 years, but made an exception for this one, right? It's how can we prepare ourselves intellectually, politically, socially, and also spiritually to not be changed as much as possible.
I think we're all feeling pretty heavy right now. Which folks, you can hear it, and we come to you not only unscripted, but oftentimes unfiltered and vulnerable in that sense. I think one of the reasons that's precipitating a sort of special heaviness and weight right now is the increasing strictures on free speech. And of course, we're seeing this among the highest levels, whether in politics or private enterprise. It's being censored. And you cannot level a critique at this government or their ideals or ideologies. And increasingly, people are facing consequences and repercussions swiftly, unfairly, illegally, and yet it keeps happening. So, Robbie, any thoughts on where we are in this moment regarding free speech? Have you been thinking about that First Amendment right that we have? We're supposed to
No,
have?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Robbie's
No,
too
I mean,
afraid to say anything, Jemar.
Yeah, I clearly.
I mean, I would get such prominent examples, right? Jimmy Kimmel, 60 Minutes, which now has been so far back there that we've forgotten that even happened, right? That producer forced to, that resigned in the wake of them controlling the story. There, what $15 billion lawsuit against the New York Times for just reporting, things that were critical of the Trump administration. Like that's right now, happening. Colbert, it's the major networks and across the board. So I mean, I'm sure there's like other like really prominent things that in any other moment would be the headline that I've not forgot to even say because there's so many uh, things out there. So yeah, I think I've been thinking about that a lot. And we all are writers and authors, and we're working on books. And I mean, I already had my book White Too Long get briefly banned at the U.S. Naval Academy, right? So are we looking at more of that, right? Are we going to have to be a year from now instructing you all on the secret bookstore that you can actually find, our books at, because they're not going to be on Amazon. They're not going to be at Barnes and Noble because they've struck some deal with the administration to not publish books that are critical of, the regime. I mean, that's not crazy to talk about at this stage. So it's, and we were talking about this earlier, that it is, I guess there's some little thread of hope that Kristin, you were mentioning too, that maybe everybody didn't quite get the "we're now against free speech" memo. Like
yeah, I was surprised to see Tucker Carlson and Karl Rove, of all people, coming out against some of these attacks on free speech, saying, wait a minute, what about the First Amendment? What about free speech? And it was honestly a little startling to me because everybody else seems so cool with it. So yeah, I wondered if they were somehow, left out of the group chat or something. But it's definitely ominous. And, I think it's worth, part of me wants to, be a little snarky and say, this is the free speech party. What about the free speech activists? But honestly, I think it's time that we move on from that, right? This is not hypocrisy. This is strategy. That was not on the part of many. Now, again, some were actual free speech advocates, but they were mixed in with a movement that was not a free speech movement, right? It was a deliberate strategy. And I think there are many of those, the seeming hypocrisies. We could look at religious liberty for as another example. Some real true believers in there, and I'll look around like, oh, I guess it was just kind of a wedge issue for Christian supremacy. Who knew, right? Well, a lot of people were trying to say that. So, all of these issues, it's pretty simple. You think. What does free speech mean? Well, you pick your, the rights that you have or want to protect, and then you apply them to your worst enemy, and it's got to fit both, right? Mm-hmm. And that equation is not operative anymore. And again, strategy. So we have to stop being shocked. We have to stop, talking about the hypocrisy, and just be really honest with ourselves and each other, what it is that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and we certainly saw this on Twitter, right? With Elon Musk supposedly taking over Twitter, right, to make it a big free speech, platform. And then, of course, it's not at all about free speech. I mean, he's piling on as well, like about going after people, anyone who criticized Charlie Kirk, right? I will give a shout out, which I don't think I've ever done, to Ted Cruz, for, also being Ted on Team Free Speech.
Also left out of the group chat. Imagine that.
Yeah.
So I keep coming back to, it's just becoming clearer and clearer. This is not right versus left, or red versus blue, or Democrat versus Republican. It's billionaires versus everybody else. Because with what we're seeing now in terms of free speech, it's the billionaire class buying up our communication channels, whether that's social media and Facebook and Twitter and all the rest, or in the case of Jimmy Kimmel, entire networks that can just say what goes. Washington Post, you can go on down the list. And what happens when legacy media is in the pocket of billionaires who are in line with this regime, because going along with this regime benefits them. They just got a huge tax break in the big bad bill. And now, just by showing up, kissing the ring, they can be guaranteed more contracts, more freedom for businesses. I think with Kimmel, the parent company is in negotiations for a multi-billion-dollar acquisition or merger deal that if they get in the good graces of the regime is greasing the wheels for that business transaction to happen, uh, First Amendment be damned. So what they've done a masterful job with in this narrative, partly because the billionaires own social media companies, is framing it as right versus left, as conservative versus liberal, however you want to name it, when in reality, it's the billionaire class and the 0.001% gobbling up all these sectors of society for themselves to control it, and the rest of us. And they are happy to sit back and let us fight amongst each other while they steal democracy from right under our noses.
Amen. And you know, I wonder too if I think a lot of Americans have become really complacent,
Mm.
apathetic even. And you know, we can talk about the decline of civics education. But I think that a lot of Americans who are going about their lives, paying a little attention here or there, probably have no conception of how these events will affect their own lives.
Mm.
You know, so the three of us, and we'll throw in Diana, four of us, right? You know, we have pretty big mouths. We're out there. We're gonna feel the effects before many of our listeners in terms of free speech, right? You know, not across the board, all the things being handed down. You know, they affect different groups in different ways, but this free speech one, right? We're already feeling it, and we can kind of see what's likely to come down the road for us. But it means every American, even if you know you don't have a podcast, even if you don't feel a need to comment on the weekly events every week, uh, you know, do you want to chat about politics or anything with your buddies on a Friday? You know what? You know, do you want to be able to you know, have some power over what you say or do not say in your job? You know, this is going to reach down to ordinary folks who don't have a platform, don't even want a platform, right? This is a basic human right, basic civil right that we have always defended. And I don't think, you know, we've had it for generations. And so I don't think people can conceive, frankly, of what it would be like to lose it until it's gone.
Yeah, and you know, and we're also the thing one of the scariest things to me is that we're already seeing neighbors turning in neighbors,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
And that's where it gets really scary because then it's not then the surveillance state that is somehow mucking around in your email, right? Which that may happen too, but that's not right. What's I'm talking about? I'm talking about, yeah, you have this conversation in the break room at work where you make an offhand comment about something and somebody's got their phone out recording it. And the next thing you know, you're called into your boss's office and HR is there and they've got your cardboard box and you're on your way out the door for some offhand thing I mean, that's where this heads, right?
Right. And we talked about German history here today, but you know, we could talk too about a post-war East German history. What was that like to live in a society where you could trust no one, not even your own family members, right? The how that affects people mentally, spiritually, you know, it is profound. And again, we're spoiled. We have been spoiled. I've read memoirs from you know, the DDR, East German history, and it's real, it's bleak, it's horrifying. And again, it's not, it changes the people who live through it, perpetrators, victims, bystanders, all of them. It changes, and we've just been, I think we've taken a lot for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the question is how to make it real, right? Like, so we always, I mean, I just remember like, you know, looking back and like you could read these horrible stories and you think, oh my God, like, how do those people let that happen, right? Why didn't they stand up for their principles? Why didn't they, you know, And like, I think it's because it's so hard to believe it's happening, right? And particularly in a place where you've had a stable democracy for quite a long time, right? As we have, it's hard to make it real, and you don't want to believe it, right? Because it's awful. It's scary to believe it. But the problem is if you sort of wait until, yeah, the PTA is celebrating the teachers that got fired this past week for not holding the line. It's too late by the time we get to that point. So at least one of the things I think I'm hoping everybody's hearing us saying is like, now is the time.
Now
Like,
is the time.
it is happening. We are here, and we should all be looking for those off ramps from the path that we're currently on.
And I appreciate you both bringing it up about it's not real to people. I tried to I talk a lot to pastors, like directly to pastors in my writing and my posts. I just put a post up regarding free speech, and I was talking to pastors, and I said, pastors, pay attention to what's happening to journalists and comedians. And you may think you're safe because you're religious, clergy, pastoring a church, but those times are quickly becoming a memory. If you disagree with this regime's ideology and dare say anything about it, then you're not, quote, their kind of Christian, and expect them to come for you too. So I think just to both of y'all's point, I mean, like, this is an effort to try to point people to where this leads.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it. Is right now it seems like Jimmy Kimmel's a celebrity. He's liberal. I didn't like what he was saying anyway. Good. I'm glad he's gone. But no, 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 no. Here's the real trickle down is losing your rights.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'm
You know,
gonna go ahead and pledge that I'll come to support both of you when you're hauled before the task force on anti-Christian bias to testify.
Robbie, I have seen that. I have seen that in my future since the day
Yeah.
it was announced.
Yep.
well, it's going to be so interesting because I always think about these counter narratives, and one of the counter narratives to this, in terms of the anti-Christian, is like the whole black church. Like, it's going to be real interesting. When and Robbie, we had a webinar earlier today where you're saying the two groups most diametrically opposed, like politically, are white evangelicals and black Christians. And so when they bring it, I mean, it's already there. It's already clear as day, right? But when you want to try to bring in anti-Christian bias, it becomes real clear whose Christianity they're defending and who's not.
Yeah.
So this has all been kind of doomy and gloomy, like even more so than typical, maybe. But Kristen, you had a really interesting talk that you gave that I think might help us have some practical handholds about maybe what to do or how we can prepare.
Yeah, I was speaking on Sunday and Monday out in Wisconsin to a group of Lutheran pastors and to the public. And I have to say, I rewrote that talk 4 times, 4 days in a row, the days after Charlie Kirk's killing, because I knew that we were in a different chapter, right? We had turned the page. And I knew that the things that I had to say before didn't apply in the same way. And what needed to be said was something different. And so I was able to be frank and be honest about where, how do I put it? Yeah, I first said, look, we're all coming into this moment from different places. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. And we're responding to the events of the past week and a half, right, from different places and with different sources of information. And so I just, put my own kind of background on the table and frameworks. My background in German history, right? My study of authoritarianism, of resistance, things like that, as well as my study of the Christian right. And then I essentially told the folks there after kind of laying things out and what I was seeing and laying out what historical patterns, which are never entirely predictive of the future, but which give us warning signs, and give us patterns to recognize. I laid out some of those patterns. And then I shared that it could well be that my time is growing short to be standing on a stage and giving talks like that talk. But that didn't mean that there wasn't things that needed to be done, but that some of us might have to be passing the baton to many of you. And
by which you mean we wouldn't have the freedom to
right.
say these things.
Yeah. Not
Got it.
talking about being,
Mm-hmm.
knocked off or anything, hopefully, right? But no, the freedoms, right? We're seeing the freedom of speech, we're seeing the pressures, we're seeing the coercion, the regulatory pressures, all of this, like the punishments, the favors, all of that, right? And I do see that we're in a different era. Where that leads, how much of the First Amendment is going to be left standing 6 months from now? Open question. But there is still so much that can be done. And in fact, the things that can be done may have to be done by people who currently have less prominence, right? Pastors, certainly, there is so much that they can do. And yes, they're not going to have, necessarily all of the protections that they might take for granted today. But this is a spiritual problem in many cases. This is a theological problem. And what I told my Lutheran pastor friends was preach your theology, right? Preach your theology that refuses to separate the good ones from the evil ones. Teach your theology that says we are all tainted and there is grace for us all, because that is the theological disagreement at the core of this whole Christian nationalist movement, right? That says, oh, no, you can separate people out into the pure and the impure, the good and the evil. And those on the inside of the system, we're the good ones. And anything that we do then is righteous, right? Morality becomes contingent upon one's loyalty to the group. And anybody on the outside is a threat, right? This is the logic of authoritarianism. This is also, again, there's a theological root here. And we Christians, especially here, some Reformed folks, although we don't have a corner on the market, but we have a theology that says that's a bunch of bunk. We have a theology that says you love your enemies. We have a theology that reminds us that we're also messed up. And we have a Savior that bent down in the dirt, right, and said, whoever is pure among you, you go ahead and you throw the first stone, right, at the woman that they all wanted to condemn, right? That's the theology. And I'm like, get out there and preach it. Preach it every day. And, for each one of us, like, find out what, as there are things that we can't do, what are the things that we can do? And we don't have to do it all. We can't do it all, but there are things that we can do. And I think we have to really start looking for those things and then start doing them, because it's only going to get harder and it gets easier. Like, once you start doing these things, like, look at us, here we still are, right? Because we had the wise idea to open our mouths, 10 years ago now. And here we still are. So, it kind of builds a muscle.
Robbie, what have you been pointing folks toward as far as steps to take, exit ramps that are still ahead of us and not behind us?
So I'm finishing this last chapter of the book. That'll be out next fall. Still no title. Still somewhere around democracy and discipleship for this moment. And actually gone back to something that just sort of came out of my mouth when we were all together at a church in Atlanta, where, like I said, the thing that keeps coming to me is that we have to find the bright lines. And then we have to stand up, right, when we see those bright lines being crossed. And there's a bunch of them, right? But I'm thinking about free speech being one of them, when people can't just words can't criticize, right? They lose their livelihood over that. And Stephen Miller openly saying, "We will come after you for your words." right? We will take your money. We will take your livelihood. We will ruin your life, right? I mean, that's from a very high up government official coming at us today. But I think that the other thing I think is that courage is contagious. And so if you stand up, someone else is going to stand up with you. I think that's the thing too, is that, in some ways, I'll confess I'd be much less likely to be on a podcast by myself than with the three of you. So courage is contagious and it's kind of helped me kind of stay the course as well. But I think all of us kind of finding those fellow travelers, right, in our local circles that can all hold ourselves accountable, can say, yeah, that's a bright line, and that's not one we're going to be silent about. We're going to kind of stand up.
I think of a couple of things. One is I'm constantly amazed that Ida B. Wells put herself in harm's way to report the truth about lynching and racial terrorism and rape, and wrote about it publicly to the point that she got driven out of Memphis. Her press was burned to the ground. And at the end of one of her books, it's sort of an appendix, and she's kind of answering frequently asked questions. And one of them is like, what she always gets asked, well, what do we do about this heinous thing of lynching? And she essentially says, tell people what's happening. Make sure they know. And it's always been this sort of partially frustrating portion to read, because I'm like, that's it. Like that's what you've seen this up close. You know how real the threat is, and your word to the tens of thousands of people who will access your work is share it. But what she's getting at is, if we don't have the truth, we can't act accordingly. And I don't think even in this information age, we can underestimate the urgent need to share truthful information with our neighbors, which means, whatever your circle is, wherever they are geographically. And I think from a Christian and theological perspective, that's your witness, is to tell the truth. Your job, and it's not really even in your power to change people, but what you can do is offer them reality. And so much of the problems that we're seeing right now is because people are detached from reality because of the information sources they're accessing. So we need to be that voice of truth and reality for people. And along with that is the next practical step, is support the truth tellers. It's going to be interesting if we want to look at bright sides. The firing of these journalists and comedians could backfire, because they're not going to stop talking. What they're going to do is go to independent platforms where it's harder to just shut them down individually, right? Whether that's YouTube or Substack or some other social media platform, we have instruments to continue to communicate, to continue to offer truth. But what they won't have is the institutional support they once had. So that means if there are truth tellers, whether they be content creators on social media, historians, sociologists, journalists, support them, especially if they're not in an institution or have been dismissed from them. So those are practical things you can do that maybe it doesn't feel like a lot. That was my frustration reading Ida B. Wells. But we can see the historical patterns. You want to know how the abolitionist movement caught on? They took pictures and they sent them around. The famous picture of the enslaved person with his back all scarred, that was abolitionist propaganda.
Which, by the way, has just been removed.
Has just been removed. I wonder why.
Yep.
Because when you get exposure to that truth.
Ida B. Wells, the way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth on them. Right? The way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth on them. And that's where we start. And that's what we keep doing.
And hopefully we can continue. Emphasis on the hopefully right now.
Or we pass the baton sooner or later.
So we're giving you all the info, and you can continue to share it. Well, as always, come for the grim reminders of reality. Stay for the community. Thank y'all so much for joining us and supporting the truth tellers. We hope you go to our individual Substacks. We are, of course, going to keep recording this as much as we can. So go to Convocation. .substack.com, subscribe there, and to our individual Substacks. We'll see you soon on the next Convocation Unscripted.